I'd like to give you all a warm welcome to the fourth session of the Momentum Knowledge Accelerator Complexity Aware Monitoring Workshop Series. My name is Lucy Wilson, and I'm an independent consultant working with the Momentum Knowledge Accelerator, or the MKA Award on Complexity Aware Monitoring, or CAM. Our usual host and moderator, Emily Stammer, will be joining us a bit later in the session. Thanks for joining us today, particularly on this holiday week. Next. So a bit of housekeeping to get us started. If you could please stay on mute when you're not talking. We're trying to conserve bandwidth for the main sessions, so I'll ask that only the presenters have their cameras on if they'd like. In the breakout sessions, if you'd like to turn your camera on, please feel free. We have set aside several times during the session to answer questions, so feel free to ask questions during those times, but you can also put any questions you might have in the chat box, and we'll try to answer those as we go. And if at any point you have challenges with audio or visual, please enter your questions into the chat. We've got Devin on hand to help out with those. As you'll see, we'll also be recording the session today. The recordings will be placed on the Momentum Knowledge Management Hub, along with the presentations shortly after the sessions. Recordings and presentations from past sessions are already available on the Hub, and if you are outside of Momentum, we can share with you the links to the recordings on YouTube, and we'll also work to make the materials available after the workshop session concludes. If you haven't seen it yet, the new CAM resource collection is available on the Momentum Hub. It includes both the Momentum Complexity Aware Monitoring Guide and many of the documents that were used to create the CAM guide and this workshop series. We're hoping to expand that collection as we go, so if you have resources to add, please reach out and let us know. And the link is in the chat. Thanks. Next. So our objectives for today's sessions are to provide participants with an introduction to outcome harvesting, as well as some illustrative examples of its use in similar projects. Also to increase participants' understanding of how to adapt outcome harvesting and to support brainstorming ideas for their adaptation and use within the Momentum Awards. These objectives feed into our broader workshop objectives, which are to improve participants' knowledge and understanding of complexity-aware monitoring, to improve participants' ability to use complexity-aware monitoring, and to expand participants' networks of CAM practitioners within and beyond the Momentum suite of awards. And speaking of CAM practitioners, we are very excited to have a superstar in the field of CAM with us today. Heather Britt is a principal research scientist at NORC, which is part of the University of Chicago. Heather is an author on several resources for using CAM generally and for specific CAM approaches. We are also excited to have Tilly Gurman with us today to share her experience using outcome harvesting. Tilly is a research and evaluation advisor with the Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs. I'll also be sharing an experience on outcome harvesting. As mentioned, Emily Stammer, our workshop series leader, will be joining us shortly. We also have Sammy and Devin from MKA making sure everything runs smoothly. So please take a moment and introduce yourselves in the chat now. If you can include your name, title, and organization affiliation, and which Momentum Award you're working with, if applicable, also where you're dialing in from today. Thanks. Next. In today's session, we'll start out with an overview of outcome harvesting by Heather. Then I'll present on a USAID-funded project in which I used outcome harvesting for ongoing monitoring. Then we'll have a short break, after which Tilly will present on her use of outcome harvesting in an evaluation of a capacity strengthening project. Then we'll do breakout discussions, which we're going to be doing a bit differently this week, asking you all to self-select a group to join based on your level of interest in and understanding of outcome harvesting. And of course, we'll end with another pause and reflect. Next. Before I hand over to Heather to get into the details of outcome harvesting, I wanted to take a minute to tie this approach back to the earlier sessions of this workshop in which we talked about CAM generally, including the Momentum CAM guide that was developed last year. If you were in those earlier sessions, you may remember that we referenced a matrix that is in the guide. And the matrix is designed to help you select among CAM approaches based on various factors. Here we've pulled just the outcome harvesting column of that matrix. So you can see that it's mostly a qualitative approach. It generally requires a moderate skill level and moderate to high levels of effort, but can be done remotely, depending on the project context, of course. It is often used in ongoing monitoring and evaluations. You'll see that from the examples shared today. And among the 5 questions that aren't always easily addressed in typical performance M&E, it especially helps projects address those related to unintended outcomes or outcomes missing from the theory of change. And it helps to identify factors that contributed to observed outcomes. Next. Great, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Heather Britt to tell us more about outcome harvesting. Heather? And next.
Thank you, Lucy. It's very exciting to be able to spend the morning or the evening with you all practitioners and those interested. Sammy, next, please. Next slide. So just a quick overview of what we're going to cover in this session. We're going to cover some of the basics about when and why outcome harvesting can be useful and the basic steps involved. We'll also touch briefly on the guiding principles that are used to tailor outcome harvesting to your specific project and its context. And I'll also touch on some tips for planning a harvest, and especially related to the fact that outcome harvesting is a participatory and iteratively designed method. So you need to revisit those design decisions throughout the process. So we don't have as much time as we might like today. So there are a few slides that I've included in here that have some substantive material in it, which I encourage you to go back and reread later. I'll just touch on them as we go through. And as Lucy mentioned, there'll be several opportunities for you all to ask questions and engage in discussion. The first, I'll do a quick pause for just clarifying questions. Once we've covered some of the very basics of outcome harvesting. And then at the end of this session, we'll also have space for, again, a little bit more Q&A. And then we have these great breakout groups that Lucy, Tilly, and I, and a few other colleagues will be facilitating. And we suggest that you save your more substantive or sometimes more advanced questions or those that would benefit from input from your peers for those discussion groups. So those are some of the points we'll touch base with each other. All right, next slide, please. Great. So I want to tell you that outcome harvesting has quite a track record. It was originated by Ricardo Wilson Grau in 2003. And for the next 10 years or so, worked closely with collaborators and co-developers like myself to really refine and expand on the approach. And since then, it's been used in, I think this number is old, but many different donors, implementers, NGOs, networks, organizations, all types have used it in Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, across the globe. So it has a strong track record. I met Ricardo in 2011 in the inaugural conference of Eval-MENA. And I just quickly realized that this approach could help answer a lot of monitoring and evaluation challenges that I was facing with my work. And I was working really closely with the Ford Foundation at the time. And they were experiencing a lot of complexity in their work. And so we collaborated to write the first brief. And then shortly after that came out, I moved to work as an institutional contractor for USAID for about 7 years. And there I had the delightful experience of being able to support and provide technical assistance to many different outcome harvests across the agency, working together with USAID partners and implementers on together to conduct and use outcome harvesting, and help set up a learning agenda so we could compile a lot of lessons learned from that. So so there's a rich experience out there and a lot to draw on for lessons learned. Next slide, please. So that's a little bit about my experience with outcome harvesting. We'd like to really quickly just take the pulse and hear about your experience with outcome harvesting. Sammy's starting the poll now, so just let us know where you fall on your experience. All right. We have quite a number of folks who are hearing about it and have maybe just know a little bit or have a fundamental experience. All right, I'm going to, all right, stop, and we have, are the results? Yes. So you all can see that most folks are kind of at the beginning of an outcome harvesting journey. Well, welcome on board. We hope you have a great time working with this method. It can be really informative and a lot of fun. Like I said, it's a participatory method, so you work closely with your peers to generate and share learning. Oh, great. We've had someone who's read a book and a couple of people, and so that's wonderful. Hopefully you'll reflect on your experience with us. All right. Thank you so much. Sammy, let's move on to the next slide. We're going to dig in now here. I think it's really helpful with methods to just give know where they come from. Methods just don't drop out of the sky. And outcome harvesting is no exception. It's grew out of the outcome mapping community and is deeply connected to that. And it's strongly influenced by the utilization-focused evaluation approaches. And I hope that you'll, as we learn together more about outcome harvesting, that you'll see the connections to both of those if you're familiar with them. Next slide, please. So outcome harvesting can be summarized really in less than 50 words, the essence of it. And you can come back to this definition over and over again, and I think it'll really help ground you. It's a participatory method to identify, formulate, verify, analyze, and interpret outcomes to answer actionable, practical questions about a program or initiative. So the method captures not just the outcomes that we predicted, but also ones that are unpredicted, or even, I would say more accurately, unpredictable, ones we could not have foreseen. It collects evidence about positive and negative outcomes. And then it works backwards to describe and to verify the contribution that the project or initiative had to contribute to those outcomes. It can be useful for monitoring and for evaluation purposes, and it's useful for all three types of evaluation purposes. That is developmental, formative, while something's still developmental, while it's still being developed in process, you're using action to generate a new idea or approach. Formative, it's in the early stages and you're providing information to help shape and improve it. And summative, when you're looking back on a project. And it can be conducted using either internal staff or an external evaluation consultant, or you might bring together staff from both the donor and the implementer. You can come up with a lot of different creative mixes. I've seen a wide variety, or it might be primarily internal, just with an evaluation or outcome harvesting coach throughout the way. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Next slide, please. Outcome harvesting. So as you all know, in the monitoring evaluation world, there's a variety of different terms and different ways to use the same kind of term. So I really want to ground us here in the essential concept of outcome. Outcome harvesting has a particular definition and understanding of what an outcome is that may not line up with the way you've used it in other contexts. So let's go over that together. This sort of map of a way of describing a theory of change comes out of the outcome mapping, this sphere, a sphere of control, sphere of influence, and sphere of interest, if you're familiar with this. So within the sphere of control, project staff carry out activities which lead to outputs. Those are within the sphere of control. And those outputs are used by change agents to influence other actors, social actors, to contribute to outcomes. All right. So really the project staff engage directly with change agents, but do not engage directly with social actors. This is the typical definition. So we're collecting data about outcomes from change agents. And generally a clue that outcome harvesting would be helpful is when we don't have direct access to those social actors. We can't reach them. So, all right, next slide, please. So here's a verbal or written summary of what an outcome is in the outcome harvesting world. It's a change in the behavior of a social actor influenced by the intervention. And when we talk about behavior here, we're talking about actions or activities, relationships, policies, practices. And a social actor could be one person, or it could be a group, or it could be a whole community or an organization or institution, right? What we're not talking about here is changes in knowledge, awareness, and attitudes. It really needs to translate into changes in behavior, okay? And outcome harvesting is a complexity-aware approach. It recognizes that there's lots of factors out there influencing outcomes. The project is generally not the only influence, but it should be, you're collecting evidence on the strength of that influence. Right. Next slide, please. So outcome harvesting is not for all approaches. In fact, it grew up to help meet some very specific kinds of monitoring and evaluation challenges. And I've touched on one of them briefly by pointing out that you're not in a situation in which you can just go out and speak to that social actor and get the kind of evidence that you need. Another situation in which it's well suited to outcome harvesting is when you're working in a project in which the desired results are big and bold and difficult to measure. We know the general direction we're headed, but we don't have a lot of specificity to draw on, right? And measurability frequently relies on us being specific. So the pathways to achieve the desired results are not well understood. Again, this is not due to bad planning. It's due to the essence of a situation that we're working in is complex and dynamic and changing, right? So for that reason, the project is likely to contribute to unpredicted and unpredictable outcomes. Again, it's due to the complexity of the situation, of the evolving situation. And you can recognize as a development practitioner, as a person in the field, on the ground, you know that you're in a situation like this when really the key to your success is flexible management, and you're continually adapting, right? A CLA moment. If you're working in a CLA kind of context where adaptation is the norm, then you're probably working in a situation in which outcome harvesting could be helpful. I just do want to stress that all projects contribute to unpredicted outcomes. It's really a matter of how important are they to your project. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, outcome harvesting is not for everybody. So it's not intended for where the pathways to achieve the desired outcomes are known and agreed upon, or where little value is placed on capturing outcomes not included in the original design. If folks are really convinced that the theory of change tells the whole story or the most important parts of it, then it's not a great fit. And I'm going to contrast training and capacity building here as a way to illustrate what I'm saying. When you're doing training, you are building the specific skills in a certain group of people. You have access to those people after the training, and you can easily measure whether or not there was a difference. And we have a whole field of literature that supports training outcomes and training results, how that occurs. So that's not a good fit for outcome harvesting. On the other hand, we have capacity building, which Tilly is going to give us a great example of, in which the path between the technical assistance and the support that we provide or a project provides, between that and building a resilient, flexible, sustainable organization, high functioning, that is a path that varies across each organization. Is going to follow a different path, and we cannot predict it in advance. So that's the difference between, so outcome harvesting is a great fit for telling that kind of a story and capturing those outcomes. So just when you're trying to make a decision about what part of your project would be to focus on for the outcome harvest, come back to this idea about training and capacity building and say, which basket does this part of my project fit into? Okay. So that's the just sort of the basics. Sammy, next slide, please. I want to give a quick example of, we've been talking here in the abstract about outcome harvesting. I'm going to give a quick example of an outcome, and then I'll pause for clarifying questions. I'm not going to go over this slide, but I do this one here in great detail, but I do suggest that when you're drafting your scope of work, come back to this slide here. It has examples of the first 4 components, brief, concise examples of the first 4 elements of a good scope of work right in here. Okay. All right, so the example I'm going to share with you of an outcome description comes from the Association for Women's Rights and Development. This example is in the public domain in the original brief, so you can take a closer look at it. And they were conducting a formative evaluation around an advocacy program in the context of in support of human rights defenders. Next slide, please. So the outcome description contains 3 basic elements. There should be a concise description of the outcome, which is the change in behavior of the social actor, right? It should also describe the contribution of the project or the organization and the change agents towards achieving that outcome. And it also has the third element is the significance of the outcome. And this I do want to tie back into the overall statement, Lucy, the table at the start of the presentation here. The significance of the outcome here, this is the opportunity to collect data on the perspectives of the stakeholders, of the change agents themselves, to talk about why an outcome is important. So that you can also include why the project thinks it's important, but it's a very important opportunity to collect stakeholder perspectives on the importance of outcomes. Okay, so this is what an outcome, what we're talking about when we're saying we're harvesting outcomes. This is an example of what a full outcome might look like. And I want to just read now the basic description. In mid-September 2011, the Iranian Ministry of the Interior, or the Secret Service, released MB, who is a human rights defender, after 5 months in prison. Now, I'd like to use this example to describe, to illustrate where outcome harvesting can be helpful, because it's clear that A would not be able to go straight to the Secret Service and say, what was our role in contributing to this, your decision to do this, right? We're unlikely to get a straight answer there. And we might not even be able to reach the Secret Service at all, right? Or find the right person. So it really helps illustrate where outcome harvesting has a special niche to solve monitoring and evaluation questions. All right, so next slide, please. Great. So here's our pause for just clarifying questions, right? So what I mean is not questions about what, that are more in depth, but just over the material that we've covered so far. Does anyone have any questions that really need to get answered at this point?
Heather, if you check the chat, there's a question from Lisa. Is this only regarding the behavior change? Is it only behavior change? What about projects which target policy or systems?
Absolutely. So if we go back to that definition of an outcome, in the narrative, it will list that it could be behaviors of individuals, it could be policy changes, it could be changes in relationships, it could be changes in the way resources are used. So a wide variety of different, we're just kind of using behavior change as shorthand here to distinguish that it's not around just attitudes or knowledge or narratives or things like that. All right. Okay, so shall we move ahead? That was a really good clarifying question. Okay, so there are 6 steps for conducting an outcome harvest. The first is the design stage. We're working with the intended, primary intended users to design the harvest. The second one is to work with project sources, either documents or staff, to collect your first batch of outcomes. The third is that you collect data directly from the change agents who were influential in influencing the outcomes. So you go straight to the source. And then in fourth, you substantiate or verify by speaking to folks who are knowledgeable but independent. That is, they are not a member of the staff of the project or of the donor, and they're not involved in influencing the outcomes, but they have information. They're living and working in the context and can report on that. The fifth is to analyze and interpret the data, and 6 is to help support the use of findings. Again, this is focusing on actionable information to inform decision making. Next step, please. I want to just stress again, this is iterative, so there's a little bit of ebb and flow between the steps. Next step, please. All right, so I'm just going to touch on this slide here and recommend that you come back and study it carefully if you conduct an outcome harvest. No 2 outcome harvests look the same. And so how do you adapt it to your project in the way that still maintains rigor in the method? The answer is these principles. We have process principles that help inform decisions about adapting the process to your context, and we have content principles which emphasize what the findings should be in order to be useful for you. So I recommend that you come back to this. So just to underscore, that is the principles that help you with that. Next slide, please. So the essentials of an outcome harvest are that they are principles driven. Each harvest is tailored to the context, but adapts to your context and your situation. It's utilization focused, always keeping in mind what you need, what actionable questions, who needs to the answers and how they will be using them. And that it's a participatory approach. All right, next slide, please. There's 4 key stakeholders that really are involved. When I say participatory, it really, we're talking about the involvement of these 4 key groups. Next slide, please. We have project staff. I'm assuming that's you. You're involved in the implementation of the project, and you're very important as a knowledgeable source about the outcomes. And often project staff may also play a role not only as informants, but if it's an internal, they may help collect data as well. Next slide, please. The intended users are very important. They are the folks that need this, the decisions, the findings to make decisions or take action. And it's important to sort out that who has responsibility and authority to take action on the findings, and distinguish them from just interested stakeholders. Next slide, please. We've talked about who the change agents are, but again, they're going to play a very important role because they are the folks who are going to be the respondents, right? You don't have access to going directly to the social actors. So you need to identify the individuals and organizations that influence the outcomes. They are your key informants. Next slide, please. And fourth, again, we've touched on the outcome verifiers, third parties who are knowledgeable and objective about the outcomes. And during that stage, the verification stage, they review the outcome descriptions, which have been compiled, and they comment on whether or not those descriptions reflect whether or not they agree with them. Right, and there's a variety of different ways that you can work with them to collect this information. Next slide, please. So here you can see again, this just a visual summary of the these primary folks who are stakeholders who are involved in and participate in outcome harvest. Next slide, please. All right, so I want to just underscore the importance of writing a scope of work for an outcome harvest, even if you are conducting it as an internal evaluation or monitoring process. And that is because that, as we've mentioned here, it's a participatory approach, but it's also an iteratively designed approach. There's key points throughout those 6 steps of the outcome harvest in which you need to return to and ask yourself some questions about how we want to conduct the next stage. Based on what we just learned or what has happened in our harvest so far, how do we want to do that? So it's important to document the decisions that you make in the early stage and then go back again. And that document really helps ground you and anchor you in this participatory and iterative process. It's useful for both the commissioners, for the internal teams, and for an external evaluator or external evaluation coach that you may be working with. All right, so very important document. Next slide, please. These, I suggest you come back and take a close look at these. These are the key elements in a sort of traditional or classic outcome harvest scope of work or terms of reference. This is the format that Ricardo has used to use. Next slide, please. I do really want to pause on this particular issue about the primary intended user. This is a common point of confusion that I see across outcome harvests is to frequently in writing a scope of work or terms of reference for an evaluation or for monitoring, we want to share the data with everyone who we think it might be useful for. So we list a long list of stakeholders. And those are terrific. That's terrific. And it is very important to keep those folks informed and about the outcome harvest and about the findings. But it's important to find another mechanism to do that and to make sure that you, from your primary intended users, you have an advisory group of 5 to 7 individuals. It needs to be small in order for them to be an effective decision-making body. They must have the ability and the availability to participate throughout the process of the outcome harvest, to come through and help make decisions that keep steering the harvest to make sure that it's actionable and useful. So I frequently make this statement and then get to review scopes of work again, and I see a very long list again of the primary intended users being a very long list of folks who could never be very difficult to corral them all into one place regularly to make decisions. So please keep that in mind. All right, next slide, please. Again, this is just a summary of some important keys to success that we've collected over many, observing and supporting many different outcome harvests. Having an orientation and design meeting with the primary intended user, crafting a manageable number of evaluation questions, again, 3 to 5 max, and they should be very practical questions. Being clear about which questions can be answered by outcome harvesting and which ones can be answered with other approaches. Use a blended thing, that's just fine. Just be clear about which ones outcome harvesting is going to answer. Come back to your primary intended users on key decisions throughout the harvest and, set aside some time and budget to adapt as you need going forward. Next slide, please, here. Here's a summary of strengths and limitations, that it does a really good job working in complex and knowledge scarce situations. It offers a lot of opportunity for participation, but that may not be feasible for every situation. Again, it needs to be tailored to each project and context, but the trade-off on that is that findings are not necessarily comparable across all evaluations or interventions. So come back and take a look at this when you're making a decision about going forward and weigh the pros and cons for your own situation. All right, the next slide, please. Here. Okay, quick. Based on that, really, I apologize. This is a really quick overview. I do a 3-hour presentation, often just on planning. So we're really running through this quickly. So I thank you for your patience. So we have a few people saying that they think that for sure they'll do an outcome harvest. And a group of folks still deciding. That's great. So our breakout groups will be a great way for you to discuss those together with your peers. And a few folks saying it doesn't look like a good match for them. All right. Great. We'll end the polling here, I think. Right. Very good. Next slide, please. All right, so you can come back to this slide, but I just did want to remind people that we have there's a lot of resources out there, including in the AEA library. AEA 365 has a number of blogs. We have the OH Community of Practice. I just mentioned the recent AEA study on planning an outcome harvest. So there's a lot of resources out there to support you, and Lucy will also direct you to more as well. So next slide, please. I think we're great. All right. Questions, comments for this Q&A period?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Heather. We have a few minutes for some questions. If you all are able to, if you want to come off mute and ask, that's fine, or you can put them in the chat. Also, we're happy to discuss things during the breakout groups. That's a great way to ask questions today too. So we'll give a couple of minutes for that. Anybody have questions? Okay, doesn't look like it.
All righty.
Great. If you do, feel free to put them in the chat, or like I said, we can address them during the breakout group. So thank you so much, Heather. That was really informative. That's great. Okay, so now we are going to I'd like to introduce Lucy, who, as you all know already, who's going to talk a little bit about monitoring the USAID funded progress project at FHI 360. Lucy?
Thanks, Emily. As I mentioned in the first session of this workshop, my first M&E role was at FHI 360. I was trained by a great boss and mentor, Susan McIntyre, on how to do monitoring and evaluation for research utilization indicators. Susan and others from a working group that crossed several USAID projects had developed this approach for research utilization, as well as information dissemination, advocacy, and knowledge management. This was back in the early 2000s, so around the same time as the formal outcome harvesting approach was being developed. They were similar methodologies, meeting similar needs. And when I first read about outcome harvesting in 2013, I was surprised to find that what I was doing had been written up, described, given a name, and formalized by others, including Heather. As such, while there's many differences, there are very many similarities, there are also a few differences between what I'll describe and what Heather described. But as we've emphasized throughout this workshop, adaptation of the approaches is expected, work to maintain rigor. Next. So the Progress Project was a 5-year USAID-funded global project implemented by FHI 360 between 2008 and 2013. The goal was to improve access to family planning methods and services among underserved populations through research utilization, and capacity building. If you aren't familiar with the term research utilization, it is the process by which research and evidence is incorporated into policies and programs. It usually includes things like stakeholder engagement, collaborative research design, dissemination of research results, knowledge management, advocacy, scale up, etc. Progress worked on both the global level and in several focus countries. Next. And actually, if you could advance one more time, Sammy. Thanks. This is a simplified representation of the project logic model. So remember, this project was designed in 2008. No one was talking about theories of change yet. Logic models were still the causal framework of choice. As mentioned, the activities focused on research utilization, and capacity building. The outputs were the research studies and their disseminated results, tools created to support the implementation, etc. Among the outcomes, the ones that were most relevant to outcome harvesting were these first two. Programs and services changed to reflect evidence, and policies and guidelines changed to reflect evidence. Our version of outcome harvesting was just one part of the bigger M&E system. Other M&E approaches were used for the other pieces of the logic model and to complement the outcome harvest. Next. Okay, so how closely did our approach mirror the official outcome harvesting approach? On the left-hand side of the slide are 6 steps that Heather presented on a few minutes ago. In the right-hand column, I tried retrospectively to describe our approach as it applies to the 6 formal steps. When I came across outcome harvesting in 2013, I looked at these 6 steps and said, yeah, we did these things a bit differently, but we did step 1, designing the outcome harvest, when we wrote up the PMP, or performance monitoring plan, which is now probably what you all call your AMELP, or your activity monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan. And we definitely did step 2. We gathered a lot of data and drafted outcome descriptions, but we talked more about identifying outcomes and drafting. And while Heather referred to engaging change agents, I was thinking about how we verified our outcome descriptions initially internally among project staff. Our version of substantiation was external validation and documentation for the outcomes. And our version of analysis and interpretation would have been synthesis and reporting. And when the official outcome harvesting guide talks about supporting use of findings, that sounded to me a bit like what we would have called using data for decision making. I'll walk through each of these steps on the subsequent slides. Next. So step 1, developing the performance and monitoring plan. Like any good PMP, ours included a causal framework, the logic model I shared earlier. It also included a list of qualitative and quantitative indicators. There was guidance on indicator sources and how data is collected and the frequency of collection and reporting. There was also a description of the research utilization indicator database that we used for qualitative indicators. And there were sections on reporting, evaluation, and other aspects of the M&E system that were used in the project. Thinking back to the lessons that I can share with you all for using outcome harvesting as part of your monitoring approach, at the stage of developing your PMP and iterating on your PMP, I'd advise fewer indicators. Don't complicate things or try to collect data that no one will ever use, and budget adequately. Outcome harvesting can be resource intensive. Next. So here are some of the indicators from that PMP, the ones that were most relevant to the outcome harvest at least. Note that they all start out with the same phrase: instances of progress technical assistance, research results, or products being used in policy or guidelines in the first one. The second one is use in programs, and the third is use in services. We actually had 7 different use indicators. It was way too many. We really only needed 1 or 2, and you'll see that we ended up reporting 1 total number across all these use indicators. The source and frequency for data collection and reporting were also described in the PMP in a bit more detail, and I'll talk through that in the next couple of slides. Next. A bit more about that research utilization indicator database. It was initially built in Microsoft Access, which was an old program, but later custom built. The screenshot below shows, or on the screen here, shows a search results screen with 5 records listed. Each record is an outcome. Some of the key fields here were the activity number, a headline describing the outcome, and the specific indicator it addressed, along with the country and the status. Was it draft or approved? If you clicked into a specific database record to see the individual outcome, there was a fuller description of the outcome, along with the partners, the internal staff involved, and the ability to attach documentation. Next. So how did we identify outcomes and then draft them? I don't remember if this term came from the original outcome harvesting guidance document, but sleuthing and slogging is very descriptive of our approach. It happened through M&E staff reviewing documents, including regular activity reports, as well as reports from key meetings or trips. M&E staff were looking for outcomes as they reviewed these documents, and also as they participated in regular activity review meetings. We also interviewed activity staff as each activity came to an end. And we trained non-M&E staff to identify and report on outcomes as well. As the potential outcomes were identified, they were first reviewed to ensure that they met the criteria of the indicator. And then an initial outcome description was drafted. Here again, my lessons learned are less is more. The process of sleuthing can be fun, but it can be a real slog. The really good outcomes rise to the surface. Whether or not people recognize them as an outcome, they are the success stories and people will eventually start talking about them. Also, train staff and let them be your detectives. Make it more participatory. Next. For step 3, internal verification. Once M&E staff had a draft outcome description, it was shared with the relevant activity staff for their review. We wanted to make sure that we had the full details to tell the story, that the outcome was accurate and not overstated, and to start collecting relevant documentation that would provide evidence for the outcome and our project's role in contributing towards it. One of the lessons learned here was to share the draft description with multiple staff. Each person brought additional perspectives, and that always helped us to get a more accurate and non-biased description. Next. So step 4 was getting external validation or documentation that provided evidence for the outcome and the project's contribution. In the previous step, we focused on documentation we already had available internally. The next step was strengthening it by reaching out to external stakeholders and collecting additional documentation. For a policy change, this might mean ensuring we have a full final copy of the policy, noting how the project staff, tools, or research were acknowledged, included, or cited in that policy. It might also mean documenting the steps in the change process that led to the outcome. Then looking for any formal acknowledgement of our role in making the change happen. Finally, we might reach out to a key stakeholder, maybe even a policymaker, and ask what role our work had in the change. The lessons learned here were to document thoroughly, as this helps to provide the evidence of the contribution. And not to be afraid to reach out to those key decision makers and ask them to review your outcome description or to offer a formal statement that could be part of the documentation package. Next. So once an outcome description had gone through internal verification and external validation, it was marked as approved in the research utilization indicator database. Here is an example of one outcome description about a policy change that took place in Kenya, allowing community-based access to injectable contraception. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see the elements that went into each outcome description. They start with a headline, which summarizes the outcome. Then the description tells what happened, ensuring that dates and locations are clear. Progress's role in the outcome is described as clearly as possible, as well as the role of others. The evidence or documentation of the change and Progress's role are mentioned, and any referenced document, email, quote, etc., would be attached to the outcome record in the database. We also made sure to include a statement on why this change was important or the need that it addressed. Next. Our step 5 was synthesis and reporting. Here, the database was again crucial as the place where the outcome descriptions were collected. As we improved on the database, it allowed us to do more sorting of the outcomes by various factors. It also allowed us to easily show that Progress contributed to 47 major changes in policy or programs at the country and global level throughout the life of the project. Next. So step 6 was our weakness. We didn't prioritize using the data for decision-making the way we could and should have. Something I learned when I went back and looked at the outcome harvesting guidance. It's qualitative data, and when we think about using data for decision-making, we think about those great dashboards that Karen presented last week, the ones with the trend data and the percentage of targets met. Helping people use qualitative data can be trickier. You have to organize and synthesize the data. You have to identify the questions that the data could help you answer, and then decide on how to analyze the data to get the answers to those questions. And we got part of the way there. We had the data well organized. We identified questions. Some of them are shown on this slide here. We tried to answer them, but only really in an informal way. We later talked about how we could have done that better with more formal analysis of our data, but alas, the project was over. Next. But we did use this experience under progress, as well as the formal outcome harvesting guidance and other CAM approaches to build on and strengthen the NEL approach in subsequent projects. And that's it for today. Any questions? And we can also move on.
Yes, thank you, Lucy. That's really interesting. A great example of how outcome harvesting can be used with monitoring or through monitoring. So if there are no questions, I think we will go ahead and move on. We are a little bit behind, so we're going to go ahead and we had planned a break, but we're going to skip the break. So we'll move right into our next presenter. We're really lucky to have Dr. Tilly Gurman with us today from JHU CCP. She's going to present on using outcome harvesting for an evaluation activity. I'll turn it over to her. Tilly.
Great, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Today I'm going to talk about some work that we did under the Health Communication Capacity Collaborative in Ethiopia. Go to the next slide, please. The Health Communication Capacity Collaborative, or HC3, is a project of over $100 million from 2012 to 2018. And we worked in over 30 countries during that time period. The project was explicitly designed to build lasting capacity within and among local organizations. And as you can see in the slide, one of the two main objectives from the RFP for the project was very explicitly around building the capacity of indigenous organizations and countries. Next slide. What I'll be talking about today is the work that we did in Ethiopia. Towards the end of the project, of the overall project, we wanted to have a better understanding of the impact of our work in capacity strengthening, and we identified 3 countries where we wanted to pilot or try out outcome harvesting to see how it could inform the establishing sort of our evidence base for the work that we did in capacity strengthening in our countries. And I was the lead on the 3 countries, but in Ethiopia, I was much more hands-on and on the ground. So I will be speaking to that experience today. So the Ethiopia HC3 project was a buy-in to the larger HC3 portfolio, and it lasted from 2014 to 2016, and it was approximately a $3 million project. And this slide, you can see sort of the multiple partners that were involved in our activities, from government partners such as the Ministry of Civil Service, the Ministry of Health, the HIV and AIDS Prevention Control Office, or HAPCO, the Ethiopian National Archive and Library Agency, or NALA. And but we also sort of worked with international NGOs, local NGOs, universities, and media professionals. So again, it was really a broad range of stakeholders and partners in the project. Next. So the types of activities that the project did, again, focusing largely on capacity strengthening. It included trainings for individuals at both the federal and regional levels in the government. A big part of the project was the transition of the National AIDS Resource Center to be controlled and managed by the federal government. Also, other activities around advocacy for social and behavior change communication, as well as mentoring for university students around social and behavior change communication and helping them think of themselves and develop into health communication and social behavior change communication professionals. Next. In terms of the questions that we had for our outcome harvesting evaluation, and again, we didn't come to outcome harvesting until towards the end of the projects. And so the work that we did was less so from a monitoring perspective and more so at the summative evaluation. So the three questions that really guided our work was looking at in what ways has the Ministry of Health, HAPCO, and HC3 Ethiopia partner organizations demonstrated important changes in their capacity for improved social behavior change communication since the start of the project. And then second of that was looking at, to what extent did these outcomes exceed or fall short of the HC3 project objectives. And for this question, I'd highlight that we were looking at the project objectives specifically of the HC3 Ethiopia project, as well as looking at the global HC3 project objectives. And then the last question that we had was looking at the issue of sustainability. We felt that for capacity strengthening, the question of sustainability is always present, and so we wanted to be explicit and explore the issues of sustainability as we identified and tracked and mapped out our outcomes. Next. One of the things that we used to guide our, the lens that we looked at our evaluation was this framework here called the SBCC capacity ecosystem. The HC3 project, in around year 4 of the project, a group of us worked on developing this framework, and it's sort of a pathway to look at how capacity strengthening, capacity building activities and interventions can work to actually drive and improve social behavior change communication, as well as sort of more lasting impact. And so we use this framework to help us think about change in capacity at an individual level, at the level of an organization, as well as a more systemic level. Next. So I'll jump right in and talk about the outcomes that we identified. In total, we had 37 vetted outcomes, and the vetted outcomes, again, we took it through the process by working with our team on the ground to look through program documentation. We then also verified or substantiated the outcomes with external parties. And so at the end, we had 37 outcomes that we had identified. And then one of the first things that we did in terms of the analysis was looking at sort of categorizing them by different types of change that was observed. And so this slide sort of categorizes them according to these different themes, and an outcome could have been classified into one or more categories. So the numbers don't necessarily add up to 37, but you'll still see sort of the relative importance of different themes. So one of the big things that you'll see on this slide is the government institutionalization of SBCC programs, with 14 outcomes falling under that category. And then the second category that had sort of the greatest number of outcomes identified was around the HC3 partners requesting our support or USAID support. And again, the idea behind some of these categories was that we felt that they reflected important changes in the multiple social actors. These changes of the social actors, as Heather described earlier, they were the ones that were changing their behavior. And in this case, social actors were the Ministry of Health, HAPCO, universities, and partner organizations. And then the changes reflected changing priorities among these stakeholders, and specifically around the desire to elevate social and behavior change communication. And so the second one here about HC3 partners requesting USAID support, for us, that was sort of a symbol of them taking that step to prioritizing and wanting to seek out social and behavior change communication into their programs. Next slide, please.
These principal partners, Ministry of Health and HAPCO, they represented more than half of the outcomes that we identified, and we classified them as sort of like these big buckets. And so one of the main changes that we observed was sort of this increased recognition of social behavior change communication as an important component and skill set for developing and implementing public health programs within Ethiopia. The second sort of bucket was around increased commitment to incorporate SBCC into their policies, systems, and structures. And then the third bucket was around sort of an increased effort to coordinate and strategically collaborate to improve the quality of SBCC in Ethiopia. Next slide. So one of the things that we really appreciated about outcome harvesting was that you could identify outcomes on a sort of over a timeline and sort of see the evolution. And so maybe some of the outcomes weren't these big, massive outcomes, but it was beautiful to be able to see how over time they sort of influenced or sort of informed future outcomes. And so the slide here, we mapped out our 10 outcomes that we had identified related to the transition of the services, the National AIDS Resource Center that I had mentioned earlier over time. And then we also were able to map it out, looking at it, what level of that SBCC ecosystem, at what level was that change? And so within this, this timeline, you see that the vast majority were at the organization level, with a few at the system level, and none at the individual level for this specific sort of category of outcomes. Next. More. Nope. Oh, okay. I think it got lost in the translation. Okay, well, we'll go to the next slide. So with the second question, with exceeding objectives, the evaluation of outcome harvesting really identified a variety of outcomes for both the global HC3 project, as I mentioned earlier, as well as for the HC3 Ethiopia program objectives. So we were able to report that out into our report for the funder, as well as for our partners on the ground. Next slide, please. And when we mapped out the outcomes, looking at it at that SBCC ecosystem level, we were able to identify that the vast majority of the outcomes were at that organization level, with then system level changes happening. And again, for me, one of the things that brought me to outcome harvesting was this idea that, when we look at more traditional or conventional methods of monitoring and evaluation, such as surveys, you're often sort of left at looking more at the individual level. So I really appreciated the fact that by using outcome harvesting, we were able to map and identify change at the organization and system level. Next. So then our third research question was related to sustainability. And here we were looking at both the practice and the policy, and we wanted to sort of define for ourselves, well, how could we say a practice or change in behavior of an individual or an institution or a system would be mapping out something that we would say, okay, well, the project is ending, but maybe we think that's going to continue over the course of the test of time. And so for us, we sort of set a criteria that to be able to call a practice sustainable, we wanted to make sure that it had occurred at least 6 months prior to the evaluation, because then we felt that there was at least some indication that it wasn't just something that happened and wasn't going to continue. And then the idea of a practice really ties to the larger idea of routinization, or this idea of maintenance of activities over time. And then the second sort of category of sustainable outcomes were outcomes that were specific to policy change. And here we define the policy as sort of a change in planning procedures or policies. So it didn't have to be like an official government policy, it could be an organizational policy, but it was just something related to the change in planning procedures or policy related to SBCC. And here the bigger idea of sustainability is related to standardization in a project, as well as institutionalization within the project itself. Next. So I wanted to just give you 2 examples of sustainable outcomes at HAPCO as well as the Ministry of Health. So within HAPCO, these were 2 examples of outcomes that we identified as sustainable. As you can see at the top of the slide was the contribution of what was that HC3 specifically contributed and what was our influence on the outcome. And then at the bottom of the slide, you see the 2 outcomes. And both of these outcomes we identified, or we classified them as practice outcomes. So the first one on the left is the outcome was since May 2015, HAPCO integrated SBCC activities and annual work plan of 9 rural regions and 2 urban administrations. And so that integration and the timeline from when that integration happened and when the evaluation happened, that fell under this categorization of, for us at least, as a practice, sustainable practice. And then the second outcome was related to partners specifically, and that they applied most at-risk populations SBCC framework in their HIV work. And so again, we had documentation to suggest that from starting 2015, these partners were applying this framework around social behavior change into their HIV work. And so they were making that routine or that maintenance of these different activities. Next. And then for at the Ministry of Health, we identified outcomes, again, for these sustainable outcomes. These were the ones that we identified here on the slide were all policy related. And so these were, again, the top of the slide shows you the contributions from HC3 and the bottom is the outcomes themselves. And these were looking at changes in the strategic plan that, the incorporating social behavior change into their strategic plan, also incorporating the hotline. So this 952 hotline, which was a hotline related to HIV/AIDS that, again, the government sort of took over and they were going to manage and implement it moving forward. They were incorporating that hotline into their core plan. So again, this idea that they were creating these policies that was going to be happening over a period of time after the project ended. And then the last sort of set of the outcomes here related to the Ministry of Health and sustainable outcomes was looking at this idea of the library incorporating our resource center that they took over into their regular operations. Next slide, please. So I wanted to leave you with just a few lessons learned, and some of these will sound similar to some of what you've heard earlier from Lucy and from Heather. For us, it was a big learning that ideally we would have done outcome harvesting from the beginning of the project. We didn't come to outcome harvesting until the end, but we all agreed that it would have been great value to have been able to start from the beginning, looking for these outcomes. I think especially to then be able to make mid-course change in the project. Second was really thinking about the evaluation and timing of other research, monitoring and evaluation and knowledge management activities. For us, it was a bit of a challenge that we came in at the end of the project and the M&E officer on the ground in the HC3 office in Ethiopia was also having to deal with other, end of project research monitoring activities. And so it was a bit tricky at times to make sure that we were able to get everybody's input and involvement. The other one is, again, Heather mentioned this earlier, this idea of, outcome harvesting is great for certain things. Again, I think outcome harvesting is fantastic for the capacity strengthening activities that we did. And so thinking about outcome harvesting is something to complement, but not necessarily replace other methods. And then training local project team early regarding those outcome harvesting elements. I think for us, we went, we came on the ground, we worked with the team on the ground, but it was a big, steep learning curve, and it would have been great to have been able to train them earlier on so that we could just hit the ground running once we got there. And then our last lesson learned was really to be able to plan sufficient time. It was more labor intensive than any of us really had envisioned. And in the Ethiopia project, Ricardo Wilson Ground came with us to advise and work with us. And it was still, even having that expertise on the ground, it was still an incredible amount of effort and time. Next slide, please. And so with that, I just wanted to acknowledge the team that really worked on the Ethiopia, as well as our Bangladesh and our Liberia outcome harvesting activities and under HC3. And last slide, please. And then there's a few resources, again, regarding if you're interested in looking at the reports for any of the 3 countries where we did outcome harvesting, they're available online, as well as we authored a sort of a lessons learned piece around capacity strengthening and using outcome harvesting for that type of activity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tilly. And thanks for joining us in the midst of a hurricane. That's impressive. Does anybody have any questions for Tilly? We've got a few minutes. You can come off mute or put them in the chat if you want.
Yeah, Tilly and Heather, this has really been great. And this is a question actually for Tilly, Heather, and Lucy. I'm interested if whether you have any examples of where outcome harvesting was used or adapted for expected outcomes that weren't fully achieved, and so sort of using the approach to try to capture how far along a pathway projects or activities were successful towards reaching an outcome versus the outcome was achieved and this was the contribution of X towards it. I'm just curious as to in situations where perhaps an outcome is partially achieved but not fully achieved, whether outcome harvesting might be useful. Over.
I can provide a partial answer, and Tilly and Lucy could step in. So I would say that among the community of outcome harvesting practitioners, I shared the definition of outcome, but there's a lot of flexibility within that definition. Some of us tend to focus on really large, significant outcomes, and then have a long tail of project contribution or change agent contribution. And then others, and so that typically happens in situations in which, as Tilly is describing, it's used as a summative evaluation, right? And especially for a large donor like USAID, who's really interested in big wins. In situations, and then some practitioners, or situations in which outcome harvesting is being used as a monitoring tool, it's both approaches are perfectly legitimate. I just want to stress that, is that you may be telling the story and capturing milestones along the way and calling those outcomes. So Tilly's graph, where it showed the dots along the each year, so those could be interrelated. So in her version, they were identified, and maybe just for the purposes of this presentation, as individual outcomes. But oftentimes, one outcome helps precipitate or lead to another one. So you could define outcome either small or large, and you could tell the story as you go along, typically as a monitoring thing, or just capture one outcome really large and tell a long contribution story. Does that help?
Yeah, I think we're thinking across momentum, which is a unique suite design, but yeah, definitely food for thought. Thanks.
And for us, even though, we came at the outcome harvesting at the end of the project, we used the overall program objectives to inform that. And so we mapped out our outcomes around these like expected objectives for the project, as well as looking for sort of these unexpected outcomes as well. And so for us, we were sort of able to look at it both ways. Again, I think had we done more of the tracking from the get-go, we could have really thought about more of what does the program hope to achieve, and even design the outcome harvesting more, I guess, explicitly looking at that. But we were able to do a bit of that by mapping it out according to the IRs of the project.
Great question. Lucy, do you have anything to add, or?
I guess I would just say that we addressed a similar challenge moving forward into the subsequent projects by integrating outcome mapping in as well, which, as Heather mentioned, outcome mapping and outcome harvesting kind of develop to complement each other, and while they're not always used together, we found that doing outcome mapping, like Heather or like Tilly also just said, helped us figure out what our expected outcomes were, and then to put in place the steps or kind of mini milestones towards the larger outcome.
Great. Great question. Other questions? Anybody? Okay. If you think of them, go ahead and put them in the chat. But next, we are going to go ahead and break out into the breakout groups. I just wanted, let's see, so next slide, please. We're going to do things a little differently this week based on some feedback that we got. I think in the past, we had just sent you all to breakout groups randomly. This week we have 3 separate groups, and you will be opting into a group based on your interests. So the first group, Lucy will be facilitating that group. They're going to focus on folks who would like more information about the approach. Maybe you're not sure if it's something you might want to use. You have questions. The second group will be folks who've never done an outcome harvest but are interested in using it. So Tilly is going to be leading that group. Group 3 will be folks who have used components of outcome harvesting before or are interested in how they might formalize it. You know, also, if you want to join that group, if you have any additional questions for Heather, I think she may be able to answer questions in that. Tilly can answer more questions in group 2, and Lucy could answer some more questions in group 1. So yeah, we will put the groups up if you want to choose, select in based on which group is most relevant to you. I think there may be 2 additional groups that pop up that are overflow groups. Just ignore those. If we have groups that are too big, we may end up doing some reshuffling. We're going to kind of see how this goes. This is our trial run.
Great, thanks, Emily. I'm not entirely sure where we got cut off, but I'm trying to identify who do we incorporate into this whole process for outcome harvesting? Is it our staff or is it the government officials? Because they both have vested interests in the outcomes. So how do we get by that? How do we get through that? If that question makes sense, I hope.
Yeah, I think what I hear you asking is we know who our stakeholders are. We can identify them as our staff and the government. How do we map them to, say, the diagram that Heather showed earlier that had project staff and change agents and social actors and verifiers? And I think I'll maybe let Heather jump in and answer that as well. But to me, I think you kind of figure out where your stakeholders are and the language that's in the guide and the language that resonates and makes sense to you and your team, what works and what makes sense. Again, when I did this outcome harvesting, it wasn't designed as outcome harvesting, so we didn't really line up who people would be, but it still worked. We still figured out how we needed to engage each person based on what we knew about that type of stakeholder. Heather, I'm sorry you didn't hear the whole question, but do you want to comment any on figuring out who's a change agent and who's a social actor?
Right. So I think it is really important to distinguish the different roles, again, for the perception of credibility, right? If we, so for monitoring, it may make sense, and credibility is different in every situation, but some donors and or intended users may not accept project staff as the only source of data for something, as you mentioned, because they're vested, right, in that. And again, we just, you may, if you can speak directly to what we talked about is the change agents. Sometimes you might use the word beneficiaries or program participants. If you can speak directly to them and capture evidence of outcomes from them, what you're calling outcomes in your situation, then perhaps another method might be useful. But just in our breakout group, Bill talked about an example where they were collecting data from the folks that they worked with directly, shook hands with. That's the change agents. But then they pushed further to say, well, who are the change agents influencing, and how does that make those outcomes more sustainable, more systems level, more ongoing? And we don't have access to those folks. So that's where outcomes harvesting strength to solve that challenge really comes into play. So we're not going to be, dictators around like which is which, but we do suggest that you push yourself to the next level, to the social actor, because that really is where you can get that juicy, difficult to measure, sustainable stuff. And it solves that monitoring challenge where that's not possible. And you may want to do it on a solid foundation of monitoring that uses primarily project staff as a source, because that's more affordable and all of that. And then push it to the next level for for key outcomes or things. So I would just complement the ways that Lucy was describing ongoing monitoring and pushing the envelope a little bit. Does that help?
It does. Great. Thank you both.
And thanks. We do have a minute or two if there's any other interesting tidbits that came out of the breakout discussions that somebody wants to share. And maybe we'll actually hear about them in our pause and reflect for today. So think about what you might say, and maybe we can hear from you in the pause and reflect. So I will move on to Emily to give us some takeaways.
Great, thanks, Lucy. So next slide, we're just going to wrap up. So a few main takeaways from today. We learned that outcome harvesting is a great approach for identifying unintended outcomes and assessing a project's contributions. As with many of the methods we've talked about in this session, it can be adapted to a wide variety of contexts. We got examples of both monitoring and evaluations today and how it can be used. You may already be using aspects of it and not know. And this is, you can look back at some of these slides and think through how you might want to formalize it moving forward. It can be work intensive and it requires staff training. So make sure that you plan and budget accordingly if you're thinking about using this method. Next slide. So next week is our final session of the series. Whoa. So please join us. The topic will be most significant change. We'll have examples of most significant change in practice from presenters from MCGL and also from Breakthrough Research. Don't forget to register. We've got the link in the chat. You can click right there and register to join us. Otherwise, thank you to our presenters today and always to Sammy and to Dev for helping out with things. I'm going to turn it over to Lucy now for the pause and reflect.
So again, we're trying something a little bit new today. Sammy, can you go to the next slide? So we're gonna do a virtual hot potato. So if we were in person together, this is the point where we would get together and stand in a circle and we would throw a ball to each other, or we would pass a drum around or some other talking stick. And each person will share very quickly the answer to one or finish one of the following statements. Either today I learned something, or I'm looking forward to something. And so what we'll ask you to do is to go ahead and take yourselves off mute. Emily will be calling your names. That's how we're going to do it since we're on Zoom. When your name is called, you answer with today I learned, or I'm looking forward to. And again, if you're in a quiet location, go ahead and come off mute so that you're ready to answer when it's your turn.
Okay, so I'm going to spin the random wheel. And the first one it's going to is Lara Vaz.
So random. I am looking forward to thinking more about how to use outcome harvesting in Momentum.
Great. Next, Deb Citron.
Hi, I'll say I am looking forward to rewatching the first 20 minutes of this, because actually I was 20 minutes late. So I feel like I missed a few key things, but it really piqued my interest in the method. So thank you very much.
Janet McKenna.
I'm looking forward to putting this in practice, yeah, with our current round of evaluation that we're doing for our data use projects.
Great. Ilana.
I'm looking forward to working with the others on this call to see how I can put this in into the learning agendas for projects.
Great. Pooja.
I'm looking forward to learn more about this because it's very first time I heard about this. Thank you.
Awesome. Paul.
Boy, I guess I'm going to be the person who learned today. It is more involved and complex than I had thought or realized, but I also see tremendous utility for it. So I'm actually, also looking forward to trying to figure out how to adapt it to some current circumstances. Thanks.
Great. Luis.
Hi, this is Luis, and I would say I'm looking forward to exploring how we might use this tool, how we might complement it with some of the other tools that we're using in the program. Thanks.
Cool. Meg Ivankovich.
Similar to our colleagues, I'm really thinking about how to apply outcome harvesting to our work exploring some of the momentum learning agenda topics, as well as some of the other CAM methods you're enlightening us with.
Anne-Marie.
I am looking forward to reaching back out to Emily, Lucy, Tilly, some other folks, because we're doing an outcome harvest right now in a different project. And I know as we start, sometimes these concepts seem more straightforward when you're learning about them than when you're actually trying to implement them. So excited that we have some connections to pick your brain.
Great. Jim?
Thanks. Yeah, this has been really interesting. I think I am interested to find out more and think about how some of the techniques that we're using that are simpler could feed into this, and how also this could fit into an ecosystem where we're thinking about contribution analysis, qualitative impact assessment protocols, and a few other things, causal link monitoring as well. So I guess I'm looking forward to thinking more and talking with y'all more about this.
Great. Seema?
Hey, I'm looking forward to learn more about this. It's new for me.
Awesome. Great opportunity. Samia?
I'm looking forward to seeing how we can use this among other complexity aware monitoring methods for where it would fit for some of the questions we want to answer within Momentum. But also, I missed the beginning, but I did want to go look through the document that Heather mentioned with the AWID example, just to see how, I'd like to understand how they walk through that whole process to answer those questions.
Danielson?
Hi, I'm looking forward to an exciting implementation of outcome harvesting in the evaluation that we are just starting now. Thank you.
Farhad?
Hi, everyone. Today I learned about how this method could be used to map project activity to policy outcomes.
Barbara?
I'm looking forward to seeing one of the Momentum Awards apply this approach.
Me too, that would be great. Nicole?
Hi, today I learned some clarifications on when it would be a good idea to use outcome harvesting and when it might not be the best approach. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, Shruti?
Hi, it was a very interesting session today and even sessions before. So I'm looking forward to how these will inform, because a lot of people from our team are attending this and we're still in the process of finalizing our AMELP, and I'd like to see how these could actually be useful for us. So that would be interesting how this pans out. Thank you.
Okay, great. Is there anybody I missed? Anybody who wants to go?
Emily, I just wanted to say, this is Heather, that I learned about some fascinating situations that folks are thinking about using outcome harvesting, and every outcome harvest is different. So it was great to hear examples of practice, and so thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks. Likewise, it was great to have both Heather and Tilly here to share their experiences and their expertise with this method. And I'll just add my thanks to the speakers, to the team behind the scenes, and to all of you, our participants. Any last thoughts, Emily?
Nope. Thank you all so much. Looking forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks again.
Thank you.